So specifically to your question, I don't think it's very prudent for the United States to try to invade Russia from Alaska. I mean, yeah, it's close. It just for the same reason it doesn't make sense for Russia to invade through Alaska. Does it make sense for the U.S. to invade Russia from Alaska? There's just not a lot over here in the way of infrastructure. There's better paths for invading Russia, and I'll talk about them here in a moment. Now, this scenario that I'm about to talk about is a non-nuclear version of the discussion. Nuclear weapons change the calculus completely, and we all know that. So this is, for the sake of argument, a conventional fight. But after this discussion, which probably will be multiple videos, you will see just why Russia relies so heavily on its nuclear weapons as a deterrent. So what would cause the NATO allies to want to invade Russia in the first place? They're a defensive force. They've made that very clear. They're not conducting offensive operations and assisting Ukraine here. They're helping Ukraine defend. Well, it would be a response to a potential invasion in somewhere like Estonia or Latvia by the Russians, testing the NATO resolve to see if they actually would respond to a country that's relatively small on the NATO spectrum. Absolutely, the NATO allies, including the United States, would respond. That's part of the treaty alliance. There's a lot of trust there, and we've seen that trust executed in previous situations, such as when 9/11 took place and Article 5 was activated by the United States. So with that being said, the NATO rapid reaction forces would be activated, and they would assist Estonia, Latvia in ejecting Russia from their territory. But at that point, you start to ask, is it worth it just to stop, to allow this to potentially happen again in a few years? What do we do about the decision makers in Moscow, in the Kremlin? What do we do about Vladimir Putin and his ambitions to essentially take over giant swaths, really just the giant swaths of the entire territory? As we saw that map at the training area where it showed huge swaths of territory that are current NATO allies. How long do we allow that to continue before NATO just says enough is enough? We had to just fight them out of certain areas. We might as well push and take Moscow to try and elicit a regime change. So I'm not going to talk about the geopolitics with the decisions to invade or not invade Russia. This is going to focus solely on how I think it would look, such an invasion taking place from a U.S. coalition of forces into Russia. So the U.S. and NATO would build up in multiple countries. They would obviously build up in Poland. They would likely build up in Finland, which is now part of NATO. We would also probably see some bolstering of forces, although they'd already be there because of the rapid reaction forces in the Baltic nations. We would also probably see some sort of buildup in Turkey as a potential for ejecting Russia out of Georgia and moving further. So with that being said, this isn't the only theater. We would also probably see forces build up in Japan. I'm talking forces like the Japanese, obviously, the U.S. Pacific forces over here, as well as Australia and others that likely would participate in this situation due to their ties to the U.S. and NATO and the West, etc. Incidentally, in both locations, the U.S. already has a significant amount of forces. NATO obviously has a large amount of forces because these are the countries they live in. But this campaign would start with a major air power campaign. You would see probably a large swath of Russian/Belarusian territory, including occupied parts of Ukraine, struck by air defense systems from the West. Now, the recent war in Ukraine, or the ongoing war in Ukraine, frankly, has degraded Russia's capability in their air power, and it is shown that Russia is quite weak from an air power standpoint. Now, the U.S. would start using its stealth aircraft, the B-2 bomber, or even if it were starting to be produced, the B-21 Raider, which we are seeing come later on in the next few years or so. These aircraft would target SAM sites, airfields, radar installations, communications networks, and defensive command and control nodes. Now, you remember when I said the F-22 had a radar cross-section of a Bumblebee? Well, the B-2 has the same radar cross-section. It's very small. In fact, it actually has some more advanced radar capability for long-range radars, making it incredibly difficult to detect, and not only detect, but to track. So you might be able to see it intermittently if you have very advanced radar, but the ability for it to track, to get a lock on, incredibly difficult. It's even harder when you talk about the B-21 Raider because it has a cross-section of a mosquito and likely can defeat all current air defense systems and likely the S-500 being developed by Russia right now. The bottom line is Russia would start to see targets destroyed across much of its front lines well before they even knew they were under attack. After the strikes took place and the element of surprise is gone, coalition fighters would scream to defend these bombers. They likely would defend from an incoming attack from Russian fighters, but due to the U.S. superiority in beyond visual range air fights, largely due to the F-22 and the F-35, it would be a losing battle for Russia. With Russian air defenses severely weakened, it frees up the ability of the U.S. to use some more conventional aircraft, such as the B-52 bomber, and it could use standoff munitions as we see pictured here. Now, the U.S. would likely lose some fourth-generation aircraft, such as F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, even possibly a B-52 here or there, possibly even some F-35s because they're somewhat less stealthy. But the overmatch in air power is enormous in favor of the coalition. Any Russian SAM sites that would begin radiating would be detected by Wild Weasel units such as F-35s and F-16s, and they would become immediate targets all along the front line. Now, in the ocean, simultaneously, the U.S., NATO, Japanese naval power would begin a campaign of systematically destroying the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, and the Baltic Fleet. Only the Northern Fleet, maybe the small Caspian flotilla, may be somewhat spared for Russia. Now, this is due to the U.S. having quieter, more powerful, more advanced submarines. And that's what you get when you have $1 trillion of combined defense budget across NATO versus the Russians and their less than 100 billion in military defense spending. The Russians currently have no active carrier, with the Admiral Kuznetsov being perpetually broke and, frankly, just a piece of junk. I mean, this is what it looks like when it's actually running. And yes, that is a smokestack coming out of the top of this aircraft carrier. It's also a ramp carrier, meaning that the aircraft launching off of it have to launch under their own power, which means that they can't carry full fuel tanks, so U.S. naval aviation can outrange the Russians due to the use of catapult-launched aircraft carriers. And you can see these. The one on the right is a Nimitz-class carrier. The one on the left is a Ford-class carrier. These are the new hotness in the carrier world, these Ford-class carriers. But they use catapult launches, so they can launch with full fuel tanks, larger payloads of weapons, so they can actually outrange the Russian aircraft in the ocean. Additionally, Russia only fields fourth-generation fighters on its carriers, which would be outmatched by the U.S. carrier-launched F-35s. The U.S. Ford and Nimitz-class carriers, as you can see here, can hold 75 to 90 aircraft when you talk fixed wing and rotary wing. When you go back to the Russian aircraft, it can only hold at a max 30. This fight wouldn't even be close, with Russian naval assets being non-existent because they would likely be destroyed by NATO naval assets. We could see the Navy join a campaign to destroy Russian land capability using cruise missiles, ballistic missiles launched from the sea. Between the B-2s, the B-21s, the B-52s, Wild Weasels, naval assets, this would all be well-coordinated, highly concentrated precision attacks, something that Russia couldn't even pull off against a neighboring country in Ukraine. You've got to think possibly the shock and awe campaign in Iraq when you talk of a U.S.-led coalition destroying such levels of capability. The Iraqis had the third largest air defense network in the world, and the U.S. and its allies destroyed it in a matter of hours. By the way, Iraq was using Russian equipment.